This is Christopher Sernaque, hosting episode 5 of season 3 of the Current Topics in Science podcast. This podcast will address breaking scientific news in light of the origins debate and host interviews with scientists. This podcast is available on the following platforms: iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Video recordings of the podcast will be uploaded to YouTube. Enjoy the podcast. Today, on Current Topics in Science, we have the honor of hosting Frank Sherwin. Frank was in the Navy and received Christ when he was in Vietnam in 1971. After he served, Frank went on to get a BA degree in biology from Western State College and an MA degree in zoology from the University of Northern Colorado. Frank's specialty is in parasitology, and he studied under and wrote papers with Gerald D. Schmidt, one of the greatest American parasitologists. These papers were published in the Journal of Parasitology. In fact, Frank discovered a new species of parasite, a nematode of the family Acuaridae. He currently is a member of the American Society of Parasitologists and the Hematological Society of Washington. Frank taught human physiology and anatomy, medical microbiology, parasitology, general biology 1 and 2, and cell biology for 9 years at Pensacola Christian College. Frank was the winner of the 2004 San Diego Christian Writers Guild Award for Excellence in Educational Writing. And Frank now contributes his scientific expertise to the variety of ICR's publications on creation science and is one of ICR's most sought-after speakers. Besides the Ocean Book, he's also the author of Guide to Animals, co-author of The Fossil Record, Unearthing Nature's History of Life, and he's also the author of The Human Body, An Intelligent Design. And he's a contributor to the Guide to Creation Basics and Beyond. Now, without further ado, good afternoon, Frank. How was your day and how are you doing?
Christopher, I am doing exceptionally well, even though we are all recovering from this wave of COVID. Fortunately, my wife and I did not experience that, so we're praising the Lord and doing well on this beautiful day in northern Texas.
I'm grateful that you and your family are doing well, and it's a pleasure to have you on. Now, since this is Current Topics in Science, we're going to quickly look at this week's current topic. In an article called 2 Reasons Why a Bad Theory Remains Popular on the Evolution News and Science Today website, author Granville Sewell writes about why evolutionists hold on to the theory at all costs, saying, "Science has been so successful explaining other phenomena in terms of purely unintelligent natural forces. Why should evolution be so different? However implausible Darwinianism is, and however inconsistent with the evidence, it must be true because it's the best materialists have to offer, and the only alternative anyone can imagine to the unscientific theory of intelligent design." Frank, what do you think of this article? And is science the pursuit of naturalistic or materialistic explanations?
Well, that just goes with the definition that the secular individual, the naturalist, has. And for them, in their particular worldview, and by the way, Christopher, we all have a worldview, don't we? We all have a philosophical outlook on life. And his worldview maintains that there is no creator, and therefore everything must be explained by purely naturalistic forces. No creator, no designer in his worldview. And just to build on that particular article, recently, and by recently I mean within the last week and a half or so, evolutionary scientists have found out that the lamprey is not really at the base of the vertebrate history scale. They had maintained it was, but now they've been finding more and more fossils that go through the life cycle of the lamprey that is entombed in the sedimentary rock as fossils. And they realize that this cannot be a missing link, as it were, to the origin of vertebrates. And so now they're having to go back, and I'm not criticizing, or should I say denigrating them, but once again, they don't know the history of vertebrates starting at the beginning. Whereas we understand that God created the plants and the animals during the 6 24-hour days of creation just thousands of years ago. And so, yeah, with that particular worldview, he calls intelligent design unscientific. But of course, the Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 1 that God's creation is not only seen, but Paul says in verse 20, clearly seen. Well, clearly seen, the Sherwin translation is painfully obvious. And so even though our creation has been corrupted by sin and that God has cursed the creation, they're still very, very clearly seeing the evidence for creation. And so I would disagree with this individual and maintain that what we see in the living world shouts creation. I would add to that, Christopher, that there's no such thing as simple life. We would maintain as creationists that if it's living, it's complex. So even the quote unquote simplest life forms are horribly complex and very, very sophisticated, starting at the submicroscopic level, that is a molecular level, and then working our way up.
That's really incredible, and that was a good quote. As creationists, if it's alive, it's complex.
Exactly. And so we would go with the complexity. And let me just add to the listeners here that as you're sitting here and listening to this, we're made up of not millions, but trillions of cells. And in these trillions of cells, we have within the DNA complex special submicroscopic proteins that we call repair enzymes. Now, enzymes help to make biochemical processes work faster. And so these repair enzymes at this very moment are going up and down the spiral helix of our DNA molecule, looking for mistakes and repairing them. In biology, we call them lesions. And some of those lesions are being repaired now. They're all being repaired in every 24 hours or so. And mutations are also being repaired as long as they can be repaired. If they can't, then they're passed on, those genetic mistakes or mutations, to the next generation. But these repair enzymes are incredibly sophisticated and detailed. And how can you have those repair enzymes show up complete and fully formed? There's no way that you can have a gradual appearance of these repair enzymes to repair the DNA and the lesions. They all must be working together in the very beginning. And then when we look, for example, Christopher, to the fossil record, we find, if I can use the phrase, the missing links are missing. Very profound thing to say this afternoon, but the missing links are still missing. For example, between ape-like creatures and man, we would say that people have always been people. People are smart from the start. News just recently shows that there is a machine that was found under the sea that is thousands of years old that helps to track the rotation of the planets. And by using sophisticated computer algorithms, they have taken this damaged machine that's thousands of years old and have been able to make a pretty good analysis and realize just how sophisticated this machine is. And so it's very, very exciting. We love to study science. We enjoy science at ICR. We do not genuflect or bow before the altar of Darwin. That makes the big difference between us and the secular evolutionary individual. And so we would say that science and the Bible go together perfectly. They go together like butter and bread. They hooked together, just like politics and corruption. They just go together and can't even be separated. So we love science at ICR, but we openly question the strange idea that you and I came from a fish.
Thank you so much for not only addressing the current topic, but for giving very interesting insight into the nature of science and how it connects to the Bible. Speaking of which, there was a presentation you gave called Wonders of the Human Body, and you responded to an evolutionary biologist named Dodonsky, who said, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And in response to that, you said, we as creation scientists would say, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of good science, and where observational science will take us. Now, Frank, many evolutionists would disagree with the idea that, say, the theory of intelligent design is good science. The evolutionary authors of the journal Nature, for instance, wrote in an article called An Intelligently Designed Response that because the intelligent design theory, invokes a supernatural origin for something one cannot yet explain, and because it does not generate testable hypotheses and cannot be subjected to empirical inquiry, ID is not science. Frank, what do you think of these objections? Is intelligent design science?
Yeah, intelligent design is science. What we have to do, Christopher, is go back to the beginning. And we know somebody who was there in the beginning who designed everything. Obviously, we cannot go into the laboratory and ask the creator to create something that is beyond empirical science. But that hardly takes the evolutionist off the hook because they can't go back in time and show how inorganic non-life became organic life. And I keep going back to that because evolutionary naturalists must address how inorganic non-life, that is not carbon-based, then through the alleged millions of years of time, became carbon-based life, that is organic life. That is a huge, huge problem for evolutionary naturalists. And so we would say in the beginning, God, we would say, yes, in the beginning, God was there. He created. We make no apologies for that. And we cannot verify that empirically. But just so with the evolutionists, they believe not in the beginning, God, they believe in the beginning, nothing. And somehow nothing through time and chance became everything. And I would ask the question of that critic, let's go into a laboratory and show how we can take nothing and produce something from it. Obviously, that cannot be done. And so we know someone who was there in the beginning. Our position is more logical. We look to somebody who was there in the beginning who told us what happened, versus the evolutionist who has no idea and maintains that at one point there was nothing and it became something.
Frank, thank you so much for tackling those objections and showing that intelligent design is in fact science. That reminds me, there was an article you wrote on design, specifically hummingbirds by design. And you began the article by saying, zoologists have wonder and appreciation for the animals they investigate, whether the creatures fly through the air, swim in the water, or walk on the land. Stanford University biologist Vadim Pavlov stated it best. Animals are exciting sources of elegant engineering solutions in aero and hydrodynamics. Frank, I'm wondering, can you tell me, how does one detect design in an organism, like a hummingbird?
Well, certainly we would maintain without glossing over that design means a designer. Creation means a creator. If things look engineered, there must be an engineer. And so, for example, when we look at bird bones are what we call pneumatic. They're hollow. And we would expect that on the basis of good engineering design. If the bird bones were solid, then birds would never be able to get off the ground. But it's not only that, but then when we look at the strut structure inside of the bird bone, we find they're very much like the structure of struts in various iron beams that we see, in such a way that it provides a lot of strength, but at a much, much reduced mass. And so, for example, if you take a typical pigeon and weigh all of the feathers and weigh the skeleton, believe it or not, the feathers basically weigh more than the skeleton, the bones do. And so we would look at that as being good engineering design. Now, the evolutionists, because their worldview says, no, this is all due to natural selection, whatever that is, and genetic mistakes. But we look at the various kinds of engineering design that we see throughout the world, and this goes back to what Paul says in Romans chapter 1, that God's creation is clearly seen. So we, without apology, give glory to the creator, not the creation. The evolutionist, on the other hand, gives glory to the creation and not the creator. So the Apostle Paul is very clear about that in the first chapter of the book of Romans. May that never be said of us. We look at the kinds of design features that we see in the world around us, even though it's been corrupted by sin, and we say, how great thou art. As a matter of fact, Christopher, what we like to say is, thinking God's thoughts after him, as we quote unquote do science, is a form of worship.
That's really beautiful, and I never knew that about pigeons. That's incredible. So I just want to make sure I heard you correctly. So if you were to separate, say, skeleton from feathers, turns out the feathers would actually weigh more than the skeleton would on the pigeon.
Yeah. So if that's approximately true, and so that's kind of interesting, isn't it? So we look at the world around us and we see this case for design, and do we attribute that design to blind, random forces, or do we attribute that design to a designer, a creator? And just as I go back to those repair enzymes that are going up and down your DNA, finding mistakes, but then the repair enzymes call in, if I can use that phrase, call in other proteins that come in to repair that particular lesion, that particular mistake. It's an awesome, sophisticated process that is going on at the submicroscopic scale. Same situation with our body right now as we're sitting here. Our body is making proteins, both structural proteins like hair and skin and so forth, and regulatory proteins. That's the enzymes I was talking about. And it is going on hand over fist very, very quickly, and it is an amazing process. The same thing that's going on inside our large intestine with bacteria. The bacteria are reproducing every approximately 20 minutes, like the Escherichia coli. Maybe you've heard of E. coli before. Well, that particular genome of the E. coli bacterium is what we call supercoiled. If you think of those old-time phone cords that would get all twisted up, that's how the E. coli genome, or the DNA, is. It's called a circular chromosome, and it's supercoiled on top of itself, and it is designed to duplicate itself. In biology, we call it replication within 15 to 20 minutes. And then you have two daughter cells, each with a complete genome. Well, that means that supercoiled DNA molecule must spin at an incredible rate to be reproduced. It's so everywhere we look, for example, the eye and the chemistry of the eye, the biochemistry is so sophisticated. We see evidence of design.
And that leads perfectly into the next question, because now that we've uncovered how to detect design in an organism, we can compare the design explanation to the evolutionary explanation. There was an article called Design of Man, No Evolutionary Evidence, where you compared and contrasted the ID theory with the evolution theory, saying man has either slowly evolved from a primal slime billions of years ago, or he's been created in God's image. The list of evidences that were supposed to validate man's evolutionary ascent from lower life forms has been expunged by decades of good scientific research. From teeth to toes, the edifice of human evolution has clearly been disintegrating. Frank, why is the intelligent design theory a more viable model than the evolutionary theory?
Well, we would look at, in keeping with intelligent design, and I build on the ID work that is being done. I salute them. They would rather not talk about certain aspects of creation. They stick with intelligent design, and that's okay. We would look at man as always been man. And so we would say that people have always been people. We didn't come up from some ape-like ancestor millions of years ago. And that the urban legend that says that our DNA is 98% the same as a chimpanzee DNA, that has been shown to be false. Dr. Jeff Tompkins has shown that to be false, and it's more like maybe 80%. that is the same between people and chimpanzees. Now, immediately, some non-scientists might say, "Wow, 80%, that's quite a lot." Well, not really. And that means that 20% of our genome, approximately 20%, is quite different than the chimpanzee. What about that 80% that's the same? Well, chimpanzees eat the same food that we eat. They breathe the same air we breathe. They drink the same water we drink. So I said earlier about enzymes. That means that their enzymes have to be exactly the same as people. But that's also true for blue whales out in the ocean. They drink, take in seawater and are able to process that. They eat the same food. They are mammals, so they have to breathe air. So a lot of their DNA is exactly the same as people or mice or rats. And you just go through the so-called phylogenetic tree and find that a lot of DNA is the same. But it's not the same, Christopher, because of the same common ancestor. That's evolution. It's the same because of the same designer. That's creation. So God has designed these various animals to take in water and air, eat the same food. So yes, a lot of their genetic material is going to be the same. But when we look at the fossil record, we find that the fossils don't fit the paradigm of evolution, saying we came up from ape-like ancestors over millions of years. One of the key, and we could be here all day, but one of the key creatures is something called the southern ape, otherwise known as Australopithecus afarensis, or Lucy, that was discovered in 1974. Now we find that Lucy was given by the evolutionist to be a perfect missing link, until it was found out that everything about Lucy was ape-like. She had ape-like arms, ape-like legs, everything about it was ape-like. So the question that the evolutionist would say is, did Lucy walk upright? Well, we just have the shattered remains of the fossil. Nobody has ever seen Lucy walk upright. And so we would say, all right, let's say just for grins that Lucy did walk upright. If we go to the San Diego Zoo, to the primate house, we would find the living pygmy chimpanzee walks upright about 10% of the time. You can tell she doesn't like to, but here you have it. A chimpanzee that does walk upright, albeit a minor part of the time. And so upright walking is not a litmus test. It's not a linchpin for our alleged ancestry with apes. So we find that apes have always been apes. And by the way, when apes show up in the fossil record, you know what they are? They're 100% apes. People show up, they're 100% people. And so we would say both by the fossil record and by the DNA, these biological molecules I was talking about, people and apes are separate.
Frank, that was a very interesting look into why the idea is a more accurate model of origins as opposed to simply naturalistic evolution. So let's take a look at the religious and ethical implications of the idea. Kurt Wise, in his book Devotional Biology, writes, "A good creator who wishes to illustrate his goodness might well design the biological world in a state of mutual cooperation rather than conflict. In fact, it seems the original creation was created with an abundance of mutualism." However, your expertise is in parasitism, which seems to be the very antithesis of mutualism. Frank, and I had to look this up, I found that there's 300,000 parasites. Perhaps it's not true, but in the world, one would naturally wonder, if there's an intelligent designer, is this designer benevolent? Does a designer actually care about mankind?
Well, Christopher, that's a great question. And yes, I would agree with Kurt. There's a lot of mutualism that occurs. And then probably before the fall of Adam and Eve, our first parents, just thousands of years ago, if you remember the biblical story that really happened is found in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 1, where Satan said to Eve, did God really say that? In other words, Satan, because he is a deceiver, a liar from the beginning, questioned if God really said that. and caused Eve to question, and we know the results of that. And so we understand that prior to that, that everything was very good, as Scripture says in Genesis chapter 1, and that there was beautiful harmony in God's creation. That creation was corrupted by the original sin, and then God cursed the earth. So as a parasitologist today, I'm looking at what was the nature of parasites prior to the fall. And the answer is, in part, and we'll never know for sure because we weren't there and we can't go back in time, but we would say the answer probably is in part, as you mentioned, mutualism. And that there was probably a lot of animals that had a mutualistic capability and that worked in harmony with other animals and plants as well. But when God cursed the earth, he cursed the earth with weeds and thorns and thistles, probably parasites, although I cannot be dogmatic about that because the Bible doesn't say, probably mutations. And so weeds, thorns, thistles, mutations, probably parasites, those last two. And so parasites were part of the original good creation, not as parasites, but as what we call free living animals, or animals that may have been mutualistically related with man and animals. But when God cursed the earth, they lost that mutualistic capability, and that these then took on a form of a parasite. I could go into a lot of detail about that. We don't have time, but I would mention something about the nematodes. Nematodes are these roundworms, and they live free in the environment. There's a particular kind of nematode that lives out in the environment, but if people get in the way of the nematode, if they ingest it, then it immediately becomes parasitic. And so it looks like there's a bridge that was a gap that was bridged by these parasites. Even the evolutionists, I've written a number of articles about this, even the evolutionists admit that from going from a free living stage out in the environment to being a parasite can really be just a one-step process. It doesn't take hundreds of thousands or millions of years. So that works well for the creationist. We see that when God cursed the earth, a lot of these creatures took on a parasitic type of existence. But let's keep in mind that in the creation, original creation, things were very good. And unfortunately, now we find many, many parasitological relationships. And by the way, we're finding out now that some parasites are neutral, or some parasites under some conditions may even be beneficial. Again, that works back to the original creation and the corruption of the creation. And we can see that maybe that's an echo, if I can use that word, of the original creation. When we find that there's, some parasitologists, not me, but some parasitologists will actually knowingly infect themselves with a parasite just to do the research. So I salute them, but I won't do that.
That is really incredible. I've always kind of wondered, like, where you'd put certain of these creatures. Like, I remember even when I took a course on extremophiles, like Thermococcus codocarensis, these kinds of amazing creatures that live in these, like, completely hospitable conditions. And you wonder, it's like, where did God originally have his place for these sorts of amazing little creatures?
Yeah, that's true. They're called extremophiles. And some of the extremophiles, this is back, when I was a kid, I don't want to say how long ago, but it was a long time ago, where one particular microbiologist who was not a creationist decided to go ahead and suspend some glass slides in the geyser of Yellowstone National Park. And he kept those glass slides suspended in this, super hot environment for about a week or a little bit more. Lo and behold, when he took them out and made the analysis, he found living bacteria on there. And thus it was called extremophiles. And now we're finding extremophiles, for example, in the superheated vents at the bottom of the ocean. The average depth of the ocean is 2.5 miles. We have vents there. Some are called black smokers because they send out this toxic material. And there are actually communities, ecological communities of invertebrates around those black smokers, including things like extremophiles, pure white crustaceans, crabs, and tube worms that have hemoglobin, just like the hemoglobin we have in our body. And so it's an amazing, amazing environment there that they are found. By the way, those extremophile bacteria that are so resistant to high temperature, you find them in your water heaters. And so how did they get there? But one thing that's really fascinating is, I don't know if you remember about 10 or 15 years ago, we had the oil well blowout in the Gulf of Mexico, British Petroleum. And there was apocalyptic predictions that because of this oil was seeping out and getting into everything, that it would turn the Gulf of Mexico into an ecological desert. But that didn't happen, because what we find out is there are species of bacteria that actually eat or devour hydrocarbons. A hydrocarbon is simply a compound that is made up exclusively of carbon and hydrogen. And God, in his wisdom, has created these hydrocarbon-eating bacterial species in the beginning. So guess what happened? Yes, there were some oil spills, and it did get and destroy some of the livelihood, unfortunately, of some of the businesses there. But it wasn't nearly as bad as was predicted, because these bacteria that love to munch down on the hydrocarbons were there to devour this and to do an incredible cleanup, a lot more than was predicted. And so that's kind of interesting, too, as we talk about extremophiles in Yellowstone National Park. Now we're finding out that we have this hydrocarbon-eating bacteria. And by the way, that gives evidence for creation, a young Earth creation, because we have oil reserves in the ground, anywhere from hundreds of feet to thousands of feet down, thick reserves of hydrocarbon. But remember those oil-eating bacteria. If those reserves were millions and millions of years old down underground, there would be plenty of time for that oil-eating bacteria to get down in there and start devouring and depleting those oil reserves. And so the evolutionists maintain that those oil reserves down there deep underground are basically pasteurized. They are bacteria-free. But how can that be with the Earth that's billions of years old? In other words, you would have percolation of that material coming down into the oil reserves. You have tectonic activity. You have earthquakes. You have all kinds of shifting of the plates and all that. And that's just in our generation. We've seen a lot of that. Imagine that multiplied millions and millions of times. There wouldn't be a square foot on this Earth that would be unaffected. And so, again, finding these pristine reserves of oil untouched by this oil-eating bacteria is indirect evidence of the youth of this planet.
Well, so that was actually an incredible answer about not only God's love for mankind, but his creative ingenuity. And with that in mind, let's take a closer look at mankind's design. As mentioned in your bio, you wrote a book called The Human Body, an Intelligent Design. Frank, what evidence from anatomy, physiology, embryology, etc., do you see as pointing to an intelligent designer?
Well, we could start at the cellular level and realize just how well designed our bodies are. I like to talk about the eye, because the anatomy of the eye, the biochemistry of the eye, so you have anatomy and biochemistry, all point clearly to a designer. We would be amazed that we can see as well as we do. Now, obviously, people have to wear glasses. You've got cataracts and things like that, the ravages of age and so forth. But even the design of our eyes is such that it defies a naturalistic explanation of their origin. But the eyes has been recently discovered, I would say within the past decades and all that, the eyes are really an extension of the brain. Our brain is about 3 pounds. It's divided into 2 hemispheres, a right and left hemisphere. And then you have, they're called the cerebral hemispheres. And then you have the cerebellum, a small portion of the brain at the base of the brain that helps with the coordination of muscle contraction and so forth. And so we find that you have the 12 cranial nerves coming out from the base of the brain, going out and making up something called the peripheral nervous system. system. And all of this is very, very sophisticated. Where did the nervous system come from? Well, I have quotes from leading evolutionists, and I salute them because they admit they don't know how the nervous system could have evolved. Some evolutionists maintain that the nervous system must have evolved several times over, but that just doesn't really work. Now, you can say that if you want to, but it's much easier to say that because of the sophistication, that points to the design inference. But then also we look at the various systems of the body. For example, the endocrine system, not let alone the nervous system. The nervous system is designed by God to work very, very quickly. You put your hand on a hot stove, you pull your hand away immediately. That is very, very quick. But the endocrine system, through the interaction of hormones, and we have about approximately 30 hormones in our bloodstream right now. And these hormones work with a kind of a lock and key effect with specific cells of the body. I've had 2 semesters of what's called molecular pharmacology, where we studied something called G protein gated receptors. And I won't go into a lot of detail about that, but these G protein receptors working in conjunction with our endocrine system shouts design and creation. Something like the ability to smell, like perfume or pizza or something like that. The evolutionary community really doesn't know how that came about through time and chance, but our olfaction, that's what they call it, the ability to smell, are due in large part with these G protein receptors. It really is quite amazing. Dogs, of course, have a whole lot more of the G protein receptors and olfaction than we do. And of course, dogs need them because of the nature of the dog. And so we have about 11 or 12 systems that work in harmony, work in conjunction with each other. And we call that homeostasis. So right now, Christopher, you and I are experiencing homeostasis. All of these systems are working together. We have a temperature of 98.6 degrees. We are staying well hydrated. That's called a homeostatic condition. When one of those situations gets out of kilter, out of whack, then we experience something called a sickness or a disease. And so we are non-homeostatic, as it were. And so, again, we would look at the human body or the body of any other animal and say it is intelligently designed. All of these systems working together in harmony. It's an intelligent design.
Frank, we've now arrived at our final question. Jamie Durant, the Director of Communications at ICR, wrote an article called Creation by Design, where he mentioned your hummingbird article and how every part of this tiny bird points to the genius of Christ. In this article, Durant made an interesting point about gratitude, saying, when you look at the world around you, do you ever wonder about the things that are happening just beyond the boundaries of what you can see, hear, and touch? How much of God's workmanship do we miss? What do we take for granted? Frank, for those in the audience who are hearing that still small voice of the Holy Spirit, how can we be grateful for God and the sacrifice of Christ Jesus?
Well, I'm really glad that you asked that question, Christopher, because that's what it all comes down to ultimately. God has given us the ability to worship Him, to praise Him. That sets us apart from the animal world. That's why I used to tell my students, we are not animals. We are created in God's image with the ability to worship God through the person of Jesus Christ. And so I always reminded my students to keep that in mind as they did their work, did their research, as they studied to be either a doctor or a nurse, to keep that paramount. And so really, this goes back to what I mentioned earlier, that when we do research, when God has given us the opportunity to do the research and to do the investigation, to think God's thoughts after Him, that in itself, Christopher, is worship. We are worshiping the Creator by giving glory to Him, the Creator, and not the creation. And that's eminently satisfying. If I could just quote from John 14:6, Jesus saith unto him, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one comes to the Father except by me. That's so critical because right now, the secular evolutionary community, not only are they asking what is truth, they feel truth is relative, it's subjective, but they really don't even have a good idea of what life is. Now, I have to add to that it is very difficult to define what life is. However, we as creationists say whatever life is, if ever we get to that point where we could give a good, sophisticated definition of the word life, we would have to say the Lord Jesus is right in the center, because he is not only the author and giver and sustainer of life, he is life, as he said in John 14:6. So to study life as I do as a biologist, specifically a zoologist, I would have to say that I'm really worshiping and investigating the Creator himself.
Amen, Frank. And that was very beautiful. And so thank you so much for your time. It was an absolute joy. And to our listeners, thank you very much for taking the time to learn with us on current topics in science, where scientific discoveries are examined in light of the origins issue. You can find Frank's biographical information, video lectures, and articles and books in the description. Please share and subscribe to the Current Topics in Science podcast. It's available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Thanks again for listening, and remember, the truth saves.